Chemical safety legislations in the lab. When handling chemicals at a research site, the following legislations on chemical safety, other than the Laboratory Safety Act, should be learnt: the Chemicals Control Act, Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals, Occupational Safety and Health Act, Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances, High Pressure Gas Safety Control Act, and Wastes Control Act. Let's review these major legislations on chemical safety. In particular, the Chemicals Control Act must be understood together with disclosures made by the National Institute of Chemical Safety. Specifically, we must look carefully into the regulations on the specific handling criteria for different hazardous chemical substances and regulations on the use of personal protective equipment for personal handling harmful chemical substances. Also, since each legislation has important guidelines, regulations, and disclosures, we must study relevant details and learn everything there is to know about lab safety before conducting tests. The next legislations on laboratory safety are pursuant to the public notice by the Minister of Science and ICT in accordance with the Act on the Establishment of Safe Laboratory Environment, the Guidelines for Preliminary Risk Analysis of Hazard Factors in Laboratories, operation of a system for certifying exemplary laboratories in safety management, and guidelines for safety inspections and thorough safety inspections. Let's take a look at the definition of some important substances regulated by critical legislations people at laboratories that handle chemicals should be aware of. First of all, toxic chemicals refer to toxic chemicals, chemicals requiring permission, restricted chemicals or prohibited chemicals, chemicals requiring preparation for accidents, and other chemicals that are harmful, dangerous, or have the potential of being harmful, dangerous under the Chemicals Control Act and the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of chemicals. Harmful elements and hazardous materials are defined under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Refer to harmful and dangerous elements with physical and chemical characteristics that may potentially cause damage to human life, property, or the environment. Meanwhile, hazardous materials include explosive substances and organic peroxides, water-reactive substances, and flammable solids, flammable liquids, flammable gases, corrosive substances, and metallurgical toxic substances. Finally, controlled harmful substances refer to organic peroxides, metals, acid-alkaline substances, gaseous substances. Hazardous materials are defined under the Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances. They refer to flammable or ignitable substances as prescribed by Presidential Decree. Specifically, oxidizing solids, flammable solids, pyrophoric chemicals and water-reactive chemicals, flammable liquids, self-reactive substances, oxidizing liquids, etc. are considered hazardous materials. Toxic gas, as defined under the High Pressure Gas Safety Control Act, refers to gaseous substances with toxic features that may cause harm to the human body if a certain amount is present in the air. More specifically, toxic gases have a maximum permissible concentration of 5,000 ppm or less. If 50% or more of white adult lab mice exposed to the gaseous substance for 1 hour perish within 14 days at this concentration, the substance is regarded as toxic. Before we dive into the main part of the course, let's take a look at legislations on chemical safety that we should be aware of as people working inside laboratories. We have the Chemicals Control Act, Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of chemicals, Occupational Safety and Health Act, Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances, High Pressure Gas Safety Control Act, and the Wastes Control Act. These legislations have important guidelines, regulations, and disclosures that support them. Therefore, we must study the relevant details and learn everything there is to know on lab safety before conducting tests. Also, we have to be aware of the definition of important substances regulated under these legislations that oversee laboratories that handle chemical substances. By doing so, we must do our best to create a safe environment in our labs. This time, we will review the Chemicals Control Act, Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of chemicals, and Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances. By doing these, we can understand the Chemicals Control Act on the general restrictions on laboratories. We can also comply with the laboratory safety regulations and understand the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of chemicals. Also, we can enhance researchers' competence and laboratory safety control by understanding the Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances. Then, let's begin our learning by reviewing the learning objectives. The Chemicals Control Act. The Chemicals Control Act. Let's look at some of the relevant articles in the Chemicals Control Act. First, under Article 9, Verification of Chemicals. If your laboratory manufactures or imports chemicals, you must submit data that can authenticate the manufactured or imported substance to the Korea Chemicals Management Association. Detailed regulations are stipulated under Article 2 of the Enforcement Rule of the Chemicals Control Act. Second, under Article 13, Criteria for Handling Hazardous Chemicals. Any personnel who handles hazardous chemicals must comply with the relevant handling criteria. You must maintain and manage hazardous chemicals and appropriately seek preventative measures against safety accidents. Prepare disaster prevention equipment and medical supplies. Refrain from storing different substances together, and that a toxic chemicals manager monitors all procedures when loading/unloading substances. Detailed regulations are stipulated in Table 1 of the Enforcement Rule of the Chemicals Control Act. Third, under Article 14, Handlers' wearing of personal protective gear. All personnel handling hazardous chemicals must wear the appropriate personal protective gear. The Act on the Establishment of Safe Laboratory Environment complies with the Occupational Safety and Health Act, rules of the Occupational Safety and Health Criteria, and regulations pertaining to disclosures on the safety verification of protective equipment. Detailed regulations are as stipulated in Table 2 of the Enforcement Rule of the Chemicals Control Act. This case study shows an example of personal protective equipment. This particular organization did not have enough personal protective equipment and disaster prevention items inside their laboratory. Each lab must have enough protective gear and disaster prevention items to cover each and every person that handles hazardous chemicals at all times, and to respond swiftly when chemical accidents occur. Personal protective equipment include protective clothing for chemicals, breathing masks, filter cartridges, chemical-resistant boots, safety gloves for chemicals, respirators, safety hats, and protective goggles. Meanwhile, disaster prevention items include sand that can be used for containment and counteragents. Each lab must have full-face breathing masks, respirators, especially to contain leaks, and apply countermeasures as quickly as possible. And Type 1, 2 protective clothing. If countermeasures can be applied using Type 3, 4 protective clothing, replace Type 1, 2 with Type 3, 4 protective clothing. Therefore, each lab must consider the type and volume of substances it handles and prepare enough protective equipment to protect everyone. Fourth, under Article 24, Criteria, etc. for layout, installation, and management of handling facilities. Appropriate indications must be displayed at facilities that handle hazardous chemicals, facilities that keep, store hazardous chemicals, and at the entrance and boundaries of such facilities. Detailed regulations are stipulated in the Disclosure on Facilities that handle small amounts of hazardous chemicals. National Institute of Chemical Safety Disclosure, number 2018-4. Now, let's move on to some case studies involving pilot plants that require preventative measures against chemical accidents. Large pilot plants that handle hazardous chemicals must be managed in the same way that other operational production facilities are managed. However, given that most pilot plants are built inside labs, supervision tends to be lax, and inspections that are normally carried out in facilities that handle chemicals are often not carried out at all. Also, in several cases, the installation and provision of safety devices, overpressure prevention device, leak detectors, alarms, local ventilation devices, emergency equipment, personal protective equipment, emergency cleaning facilities, tend to be insufficient. Therefore, labs must receive inspections, initial, regular, on demand, for facilities that handle chemicals and manage its operations safely in compliance with the Chemicals Control Act. Next are case studies of labs that require improvements to their safety devices, leak detection and alarm equipment, ventilation and discharge equipment. In particular, one lab required the safety equipment to prepare against the toxicity, combustibility, and inflammability of the chemical, while another lab required confirmation on whether the capacity of its local ventilation device was adequate or not. In some cases, labs must confirm the adequacy of their water supply and drainage equipment, as well as emergency equipment or washing facilities, and review the validity of static removal equipment. Labs should also install leak detectors, alarms, and explosion-proof equipment in areas with explosion risks. Fifth, under Article 26, self-inspection of handling facilities, etc., an entity that installs or operates a facility designed to handle hazardous chemicals must execute at least one inspection per week. Inspections must focus on spill or leaks due to the corrosion of equipment, seal of storage containers, damage corrosion cracks on containers, possibility of fire or explosion of reactive substances, operational status of leak detectors, safety valves, alarms, and operational status of thermometers, pressure gauges. Detailed regulations are specified in the Enforcement Rule of the Chemicals Control Act, Form No. 42, Self-Inspection Log. Sixth, under Article 42, Reporting of Occurrence of Chemical Accidents, etc. When a chemical accident occurs, the lab must execute emergency measures to contain the disaster, suspend the operation of handling facilities if the accident is deemed significant and urgent. Also, the lab must report immediately within 15 minutes of the accident to competent authorities. Detailed regulations are stipulated under the Ministry of Environment Established Rule No. 632, Regulation on the Immediate Reporting of Chemical Accidents. Then what constitutes a chemical accident? Chemical accidents refer to situations where people or the environment is exposed to a chemical substance due to an error made by lab personnel, worker, equipment failure or deterioration, natural disaster, transportation, delivery accident, etc. Now, shall we look at the legislative details required when manufacturing or importing chemicals? Any person who intends to manufacture or import a chemical, where a person entrusts the import of a chemical to an import agent referring to the import agent, shall verify whether the relevant chemicals or any ingredient thereof falls under any of the following or prescribed by ordinance of the Ministry of Environment and submit the details thereof to the Minister of Environment. Here, we have existing chemical substances pursuant to Article 2, Item 3 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals. New chemical substances pursuant to Article 2, Item 4 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals. And toxic substances, substances subject to permission, restricted substances, prohibited substances, and accident preparedness substances. Notwithstanding Paragraph 1, the provision of Paragraph 1 shall not apply to chemicals that meet the standards prescribed and publicly notified by the Minister of Environment, such as cases where chemicals contained in a product that performs a certain function in a solid state are not released during the use of the product. Also, where any person who intends to manufacture or import chemicals pursuant to Paragraph 1 deems it necessary to verify the chemicals, he/she may request the Minister of Environment to certify whether the relevant chemicals or any ingredient thereof falls under any of the subparagraphs of Paragraph 1, along with data prescribed by ordinance of the Ministry of Environment. Most reagents handled at laboratories are imported chemicals. The person in charge of the corresponding lab must share relevant purchasing details with corresponding departments, purchasing team, safe environment team, etc. In particular, almost all samples delivered by reagent companies are imported directly from overseas and not legally approved. Check Article 9, Verification of Chemicals, of the Chemicals Control Act. Therefore, the person in charge must share details of the sample with relevant departments or submit the verification of materials to the Korea Chemicals Management Association in compliance with the enforcement rule. Additionally, reagents used for experimenting, researching, testing, or chemicals used in trial productions must be submitted within 30 days of importing, and all relevant records must be retained for 5 years under Article 50. Recording and retention of documents of the Chemicals Control Act. The relevant enforcement rules state that any person who manufactures, imports chemicals must submit documents required for the verification of chemicals to the Korea Chemicals Management Association, along with the specification of ingredients stating the names, content, CAS numbers of chemicals and detailed statement of verification, attached Form Number 1. A detailed statement of verification regarding a chemical not directly related to a release in the market, such as a reagent for experimenting, research, testing, or a chemical for trial production, may be submitted within 30 days after it is manufactured or imported. Here, we have a case study regarding the labeling of hazardous chemicals. Inspections revealed unsatisfactory labeling and indicating of hazardous chemicals inside this lab. Hazardous chemicals are physically dangerous and harmful, which means accidents can happen when different chemicals are stored together. Therefore, each lab must compile a list of all chemical substances it uses and classify hazardous chemicals separately. Also, labs must designate separate sections in storage rooms and laboratory cabinets to store hazardous chemicals according to their material characteristics, so that acidic substances, alkaline substances, solvents, and solids, powders, do not react with one another. Facilities that handle hazardous chemicals must be installed and managed in compliance with criteria on the layout, installation, and management enforced by the Ministry of Environment. Here, labs can look to the implementation method to execute inspections on lab facilities that handle hazardous chemicals for reference. According to the disclosure on facilities that handle hazardous chemicals in small quantities, laboratories do not fully satisfy the criteria for facilities that handle hazardous chemicals as specified in Article 24 of the Chemicals Control Act and Table 5 of the Enforcement Rule of the Chemicals Control Act. As such, on July 3, 2018, the National Institute of Chemical Safety disclosed a separate management criteria for labs that handle hazardous chemicals in small quantities and schools that handle hazardous chemicals. National Institute of Chemical Safety Disclosure Number 2018-4. When a laboratory handles hazardous chemicals in small quantities, it must comply with the installation and management criteria for facilities that manufacture, use hazardous chemicals in small quantities, as disclosed by the National Institute of Chemical Safety. In particular, it must comply with Table 1, Table 2, and Table 3. When conducting inspections on such labs, only items stipulated by the National Institute of Chemical Safety are inspected. Let's take a look at the key details of the relevant disclosure. The criteria for small quantities stated in Article 2 shall comply with the regulation on the criteria for small quantities of different hazardous chemicals, disclosed by the Ministry of Environment pursuant to Article 23 of the Act and Article 19, Paragraph 3 of the Enforcement Rule. According to Article 3, facilities that handle hazardous chemicals in small quantities. Facilities that handle hazardous chemicals in small quantities refers to any one of the following facilities: laboratory facilities that manufacture, use, or store hazardous chemicals under the criteria used to define small quantities as specified under Article 2, Item 2 of the Act of the Establishment of Safe Laboratory Environment, and school facilities that manufacture, use, or store hazardous chemicals under the criteria used to define small quantities as specified under Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the Act on the Prevention of and Compensation for Accidents at School. Article 4. Installment and Management Criteria for Facilities that Handle Hazardous Chemicals in Small Quantities features the installment and management criteria for facilities that manufacture, use hazardous chemicals in small quantities. Installment and management criteria for facilities that keep hazardous chemicals in small quantities, and the installment and management criteria for facilities that store hazardous chemicals in small quantities. Please check the attached table for more details. Article 5. Inspection Details and Methods includes inspection items, inspection details, and inspection methods for facilities that handle hazardous chemicals in small quantities, stipulated under the detailed guideline on the initial, regular, on-demand inspection of facilities that handle hazardous chemicals, enforced by the Ministry of Environment and required by the National Institute of Chemical Safety. Let's take a closer look at some of the more important details from the management criteria disclosed by the National Institute of Chemical Safety. All personnel must be aware of these criteria items when handling hazardous chemicals in the lab. We will begin with Table 1, then move on to Tables 2 and 3. Let's take a closer look at some of the more important details from the management criteria disclosed by the National Institute of Chemical Safety. All personnel must be aware of these criteria items when handling hazardous chemicals in the lab. We will begin with Table 1, then move on to Tables 2 and 3. Now, let's find out more about the important details of the installment and management criteria for facilities that store hazardous chemicals in small quantities. First, in order to prevent accidents, labels must be affixed in locations that do not impede accident prevention measures for pumps, valves, switches, etc. of electric motors and other equipment that handle hazardous chemicals. Also, measures that can prevent temperature hikes must be installed when stacking up hazardous chemicals that can ignite naturally. Containers must be kept at storage facilities in compliance with Table 3. However, opened containers with leftover materials inside, individual containers maximum 200 liters, can be stored in a cabinet that complies with the relevant criteria. Cabinets must be able to withstand any stress caused by the weight of containers, and containers with hazardous chemicals in them must not fall off easily. Also, locks must be installed on cabinets, and they must be managed properly. Finally, cabinets must be made with materials that can mechanically and chemically handle the substance that is stored. Moving on, we have the criteria for damage containment facilities. First of all, facilities or locations that handle inflammable, harmful chemicals must be equipped with fire-extinguishing equipment. And to prevent damage by hazardous chemicals, labs must have medical supplies and disaster prevention equipment on hand. Then what about the management criteria? When using containers carrying hazardous chemicals on the move, they must be anchored to a mobile equipment first. When repairing, cleaning, and removing equipment used for handling hazardous chemicals, measures required to ensure the safety handling the equipment must be implemented. To ensure the safety of facilities that handle hazardous chemicals, appropriate labels and indications clearly stating that the facility handles hazardous chemicals or access of unauthorized personnel is restricted must be affixed in appropriate areas. Also, protocols must be established to prohibit the access of unauthorized personnel. Also, to prevent explosions, fires, or the leakage of substances due to errors committed by personnel supplying raw materials to a facility that handles hazardous chemicals, the raw material type, name of the raw material supply equipment, etc., must be specified in locations that are highly visible to the handler of those materials. As for valves installed closest to the storage facility for hazardous chemicals, open them only when sending or receiving the substance. Automatic valves and emergency shutdown valves should remain open. Connections to equipment used for handling hazardous chemicals must not suffer from any leaks, and inspections should be carried out at least once a week. However, if the lab executes in-house inspections and records the result in an inspection log in compliance with Article 26, Paragraph 1 of the Act, and Article 26 of the Enforcement Rule, it does not have to carry out inspections on a weekly basis. When handling and storing hazardous chemicals that can be affected by risk factors such as temperature, humidity, and pressure, labs must maintain the appropriate temperature, humidity, and pressure conditions for each substance. Moving on, let's find out more about the important details of the installment and management criteria for facilities that store hazardous chemicals in small quantities. First of all, you must refrain from keeping flammable substances in excess near storage facilities that handle explosive, flammable, oxidative, self-reactive, self-igniting, and self-heating hazardous chemicals. Only keep the amount that is required for a specific task or purpose. The basics of the management criteria are the same as Table 1. However, you must inspect for any anomalies and repair the equipment if necessary before and after using the storage facility. Now, let's find out more about the important details of the installment and management criteria for facilities that store hazardous chemicals in small quantities. First, take a look at the criteria for handling facilities. When storing different types of hazardous chemicals in the same storage facility, consider the reactivity between chemical substances and divide them up with partitions or lines on the floor. When installing cabinets and shelves to store containers with hazardous chemicals, you must anchor cabinets onto a solid foundation, build cabinets in a way that can sufficiently withstand the weight of the containers, and ensure that containers with hazardous chemicals cannot fall off easily. Also, cabinets must be made with materials that can mechanically and chemically handle the substance it has to store. Next, let's look at other storage equipment. When storing hazardous chemicals that may produce vapors or gas indoors, ventilation equipment must be installed, or other necessary measures must be taken to ensure safety. However, buildings with effective ventilation, or buildings that cannot facilitate ventilation equipment structurally due to the purpose of the building, may elect not to install ventilation equipment. Our next section deals with the criteria for accident prevention. For more details, please refer to the criteria for accident prevention in Table 1 and Table 2. Meanwhile, the criteria for damage containment is the same with the criteria for accident prevention in Table 1. Other than that, facilities that handle hazardous liquid chemicals or gaseous chemicals must have a detection and alarm warning system. However, exceptions may be made when handling a hazardous chemical in a state that is difficult to detect, gels, etc., at room temperature and atmospheric pressure. Now, shall we take a look at the management criteria? The boundaries of outdoor storage facilities must be marked clearly, and the doors, windows, and locks installed at storage facilities must be managed appropriately to prevent any corrosion or deterioration. Locks must be managed appropriately as well. To ensure the safety of facilities that handle hazardous chemicals, appropriate labels and indications clearly stating that the facility handles hazardous chemicals or access of unauthorized personnel is restricted must be affixed in appropriate areas. Also, protocols must be established to prohibit the access of unauthorized personnel. Also, let's go over the management criteria for storage facilities. First, you must separate containers to be stored from containers that have been opened and keep them in separate storage locations. Second, you must remove all objects excluding items such as meters and gauges that are operationally necessary from storage facilities. Third, you must keep all flammable objects or ignitable substances at least 2 meters away from storage facilities. Fourth, you must consider the properties of each substance and keep storage containers away from direct sunlight. Fifth, you must ensure that storage containers cannot be damaged by falling over. Implement measures to prevent valve damage, and make sure not to handle containers with excessive force. And finally, you must not carry light sources other than explosion-proof handheld flashlights into facilities storing containers full of explosive, flammable, water-reactive hazardous chemicals. Handlers must keep track of the exact storage volume, dispense volume for hazardous chemicals at storage facilities. Records must always match the information in management logs. Also, handlers must keep containers with hazardous chemicals in a solid state closed. Meanwhile, containers with hazardous chemicals in a liquid state or gaseous state must be kept hermetically sealed. Handlers must carry out inspections to ensure that these storage containers do not suffer from any damage, corrosion, or cracks. Handlers must prevent containers from being contaminated or damaged to keep labels with information on the hazardous chemical clean and visible. Containers must be made with materials that do not suffer from distortion or damage due to the hazardous chemical it stores. Also, they must use different materials and have the right thickness and structure required to suit the properties of different chemicals. Last but not least, you must refrain from storing hazardous chemicals with food, feed, medical supplies, and other facilities in the same facility. Inspections on facilities that handle hazardous chemicals can be executed in compliance with the Act on the Establishment of Safety Laboratory Environment. Laboratories can incorporate the critical inspection items, total 21 items, stipulated in the Chemicals Control Act in the inspection items for hazardous chemicals handling facilities. In the Guideline on Laboratory Safety Diagnostics for Chemical Safety to cooperate with relevant departments and prevent redundant inspections. Pilot plants featuring pilot production equipment for laboratories or research institutes. Inspections on hazardous chemicals handling facilities are required depending on the size of such facilities in compliance with the Chemicals Control Act. Also, existing facilities, before 2015, must go through regular inspections every 2 years and receive an initial inspection in the event facilities are modified. As for new facilities, after 2015, initial inspections prior to initial operations must be carried out. Once online, new facilities must go through inspections every 2 years and receive an initial inspection when facilities are modified. Let's take a look at the disclosure on the installment and management criteria for facilities that handle hazardous chemicals. Pilot production equipment in Article 2, Terms and Definitions, refer to the following affiliated facilities attached to laboratories as specified in Article 2, Item 2 of the Act on the Establishment of Safe Laboratory Environment. Batch processing equipment with a processing capacity of 100 kilograms or greater per batch. Continuous processing equipment with a processing capacity of 10 kilograms or greater per hour, or equipment with an operational period that exceeds 60 days. Act on registration, evaluation, etc. of chemicals. Any person who intends to manufacture or import a new chemical substance or at least 1 ton per year of an existing chemical substance subject to registration must register the chemical substance before he/she manufactures or imports the substance. Now, shall we look at how chemical substances are categorized? Existing chemical substances refer to the following chemicals. Chemical substances publicly notified by the Minister of Environment in consultation with the Minister of Employment and Labor, which were domestically distributed for commercial purposes before February 2, 1991, and chemical substances publicly notified by the Minister of Environment. The hazard reviews thereof have been conducted pursuant to the former Toxic Chemicals Control Act after February 2, 1991. New chemical substances refer to all chemical substances, excluding existing chemical substances. Also, existing chemical substances subject to registration refer to existing chemical substances that require hazard reviews pursuant to Article 18 or risk assessments pursuant to Article 24 as part of the registration process. The Minister of Environment discloses such substances pending the deliberation by the Chemical Substance Evaluation Committee established under Article 7 of the Act. According to Article 11, Paragraph 1 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals, any person who intends to manufacture or import a new chemical substance or an existing chemical substance subject to registration may do so without registration. Details related to exemptions are stipulated under Article 11 of the Enforcement Rule of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals. Chemical substances, such as reagents for scientific experiments, analyses, or chemical research, and other chemical substances for research and development that fall under any of the following categories may be exempt from registration. First, when developing new chemical substances or products. Second, when improving or developing production processes. Third, when testing the application of chemical substances in places of business. Fourth, when commencing the pilot production of chemical substances or products. Exemptions can be made pursuant to Article 11 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals for chemical substances, such as reagents used in scientific experiments, analyses, or chemical research. Here, the laboratory must fill out the application for the verification of exemption from registration, Chemicals Control Act, attached Form Number 6, and attach all relevant materials, then submit the application to the Korea Environment Corporation. Paperwork for reagents used for experiments, tests, research, pilot production, or chemical substances with no direct connection to products released onto the market can be submitted within 14 days of the manufacturing date or importing date. However, under the Chemicals Control Act, the detailed statement of verification must be submitted within 30 days when importing a reagent in compliance with Article 9 of the Act. In such cases, the detailed statement of verification for imported substances specified under the Chemicals Control Act and the application for the verification of exemption from registration specified under the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals are submitted together as well. Pursuant to Article 51 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals, Penalty Provisions, if a person violates Article 11 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals and fails to obtain the confirmation of exemption from reporting, or falsely obtains the confirmation of exemption from reporting before importing a new chemical substance or an existing substance subject to registration, he/she may be subject to no more than 3 years imprisonment or a fine not exceeding 50 million Korean won. Pursuant to Article 44, Keeping and Retaining of Documents, and Article 11, Paragraph 2 of the Act on Registration, Evaluation, etc. of Chemicals, applications for the verification of exemption from registration must be kept and retained for 5 years. On the safety control of hazardous substances. Laboratories generally handle flammable, toxic, corrosive, unstable, and highly reactive chemical substances. They handle a wider variety of smaller amounts of chemicals compared to mass production facilities. In particular, hazardous substances must be handled in compliance with the handling criteria stipulated under the Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances. However, laboratories by nature use these substances in small quantities. Therefore, in several cases, the use of a substance may fall under the designated quantity for hazardous substances specified under the Act. For these instances, each special city, metropolitan autonomous city, province, special self-governing province has its own technical criteria for storing and handling hazardous substances below the designated quantity. The Seoul City Ordinance on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances offers separate regulations when using hazardous substances below the designated quantity and using hazardous substances in small volumes. First, if we look at the storage and handling criteria for the former, Article 3 of the Seoul City Ordinance on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances stipulates 5 universal criteria items and 19 regulations specifically for the small volume use of hazardous substances. Pursuant to Article 4 of the Seoul City Ordinance on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances, the criteria for storage and handling facilities that handle hazardous substances in small quantities has 12 universal criteria items and divides cases into 3 categories. When storing and handling indoors, when storing and handling outdoors, and when storing and handling in tanks. Tanks are further divided into underground tanks and mobile tanks. Pursuant to Article 5, Paragraph 2 of the Seoul City Ordinance on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances, the criteria for temporary storage handling facilities when using hazardous substances above the designated quantity has 6 universal criteria items. Take a look at the case study showing the illegal handling of hazardous substances. In several cases, hazardous substances were stored in large quantities inside the reagent storage room at the lab, and different substances were kept negligently together. As such, the Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances prohibits the mixed storage of different hazardous substances. Flammable liquids and flammable solids, flammable liquids and self-reactive solids can be stored together. However, other substances cannot be stored together under the Act on the Safety Control of Hazardous Substances. They must be stored separately, even inside laboratories.
Check with quiz to make sure you understand the course. Check with quiz to make sure you understand the course.
Let's review what we have learned today.